Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this next installation of Public Education Week. My name is Nahliah Weber. I'm the Executive Director of the Orleans Public Education Network. We are an organization that fights with and for community to be actively engaged in education policy and to actively fight for equity and justice for all of our public school students. We are happy to have Andrea Fullington with us today, founder of Black Teacher Griot, long-term educator, who's going to be talking to us about some of the experiences that Black teachers have in New Orleans public schools. So we're really excited, again, to have this conversation. What we hope to get out of it is a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the experience of Black teachers and what are the kinds of things that need to happen to create spaces where they are welcome, where they're honored, where their work is validated, and so those same things can be transferred to the students in the classroom. So Andrea, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and we'll get started.
Awesome. My name is Andrea Fullington. I am a lifelong educator, as you mentioned, originally from California. I've been living in New Orleans for about 4.5 years. I'm the founder of Black Teacher Griot, which is a local collective committed to amplifying the voices of Black teachers. We host events for them to gather, network, support one another, and also run a blog aimed at sort of collecting voices of Black teachers who are in the classroom. So the point is to sort of shed light on our experiences, but then also create a support network here locally to be able to sustain our longevity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely wonderful. And can you talk a little bit about why you felt the need to create Black Teacher Griot? Like, how did we get there?
Yeah, when I started the work, I actually assumed that a lot of what I was experiencing in New Orleans was unique and different, and a lot of the more negative experiences, negative racialized experiences that I was having in the classroom with administration in different schools was overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
What I realized later is that Black teachers everywhere are going through these issues. The difference is that in New Orleans, it can feel very, very isolating and very lonely because of our all charter district. There's little to no connection across schools and across networks. So even though you might have somebody 2 blocks over at a school who's dealing with a lot of the same sort of issues that you are, you never talk to them, you never feel it, and it can be really isolating and lonely. So I wanted to create a space where an organization or a collective where we could gather, sort of vent out our issues, and then talk about how to problem solve around them without the immediate solution being to leave the classroom. Because that's what I'm finding a lot within my own community. There's a lot of young Black educators who come in here super gung-ho, really excited to do the work,
Mm-hmm.
really striving to be liberatory educators, but have issues with administration, they have issues with curriculum, they're facing individual racism, cultural and institutional racism, and so they get overwhelmed and they just leave. So wanted to create that space.
Right. Well, let's get into some of those experiences, those racialized experiences that you mentioned before. What there's a lot of ways that we can start this conversation, but can you just kind of describe for us what you mean by, racism in schools, these racialized experiences? Just give us a couple of examples, and then we'll use those as jumping off points for future conversation.
Sure. So the individual racism obviously is like what everyone is the most comfortable with, and it's being treated negatively, differently, like you're not as good. And I feel like a lot of Black teachers face that often, these experiences where you're automatically expected to do more work, for instance, because you're Black and therefore have a better rapport with students, or it's assumed that you have a better rapport with parents. And so a lot of Black men especially talk about a heavier workload that's just expected of them. Additionally, you'll find a lot of teachers, a lot of Black educators say that because they have a good rapport with their students, because they do things like acknowledge community and parents, they get stuck in their roles and they don't have any opportunity for growth. Administration will just be like, oh, well, you're great at what you do. I'm going to stick you in this little corner here, and this is kind of where you stay. So I read an article yesterday that didn't describe it as a glass ceiling. It described it as a broken rung. So you're trying to climb, but you can't, because they stick you in a certain role because of your relationships with students, because you're amazing, because of Black Girl Magic and your dopeness. On the institutional front, a lot of teachers are struggling with the cognitive dissonance around having to apply certain policies that negatively impact Black students. So we all know about the school to prison pipeline. If you're in a school that is constantly focused on uniforms and is telling you that you have to write a kid up every time his shoes don't match or her tie isn't right or something like that, those write-ups lead to suspensions, lead to the pipeline. So having to consistently enforce policies that really negatively impact our students, not in small, tiny ways, but in ways that research shows can have an impact on their ability to graduate, or just their educational future, period. So that's a struggle. And then the cultural aspect, cultural racism refers to this sort of idea that that whiteness is always right. And so it's a lot around respectability politics, how to speak, how to dress, how to behave. All of those ideas that we have around those things are coded racism. They're really sort of saying that, like, proximity to whiteness, the closer that we can get to whiteness, the better. And so when we're having to enforce those things on students, or even when we're having staff and administration enforce them on us, it's hard. And so when you're walking into buildings and that's what you're dealing with every single day, all three of those things, in addition to the workload that comes with being a teacher, it can be a lot. It can be a lot.
Thank you for that. And, for the audience purposes, we often hear things like, well, we need more teachers, or we need more teachers, period, or we need more Black teachers. There aren't a lot of Black teachers in our schools. It's actually not true. We actually have a lot of Black teachers in our public schools. In that the distribution of our Black teachers actually, it kind of parallels the distribution of our grading system that marks it from high quality to so-called low quality schools. And the schools that are graded as lower, are D and F rated schools, their student bodies are majority and super majority Black and low income, and their teaching staffs are also majority Black as well. And so there's a bit of a segregation there, but we do have a lot of Black teachers in front of Black students, but that's not the fix-all, right? Because if you have to walk into schools that are led with some of these ideas and precepts that you mentioned, having a Black teacher in front of the child is not enough when they're operating in a system that is culturally, institutionally, and individually racist. I read an article not too long ago. It's an opinion piece from a Black male teacher's perspective about his call to not be used as the dean of discipline. And you mentioned how you kind of get pegged, and how Black teachers might get pegged in some of those roles. If you go a little bit deeper into that, what are we seeing, right, in terms of the distribution of roles and responsibility and authority and power that's happening in schools with our Black educators?
Yeah, what's that for sure? It's definitely that. Dean of Culture is a big one. Dean of Culture, my friend here, who's an organizer, sort of described it as like a graveyard role. It's like where Black educators go to die, because once you become Dean of Culture, you are never going to be anything else. You're essentially going to be asked to lead detention. You're going to be asked to make the phone calls home. You're going to be
Kicked out of
asked
class.
an in-school suspension where all the kids that don't nobody want to deal with get thrown, that kind of thing. So it's it's a bit of a catch-22, because when I walk into schools and I see a Black dean of culture, I'm like, yes, like at least the person who is handling this, hopefully, all skin folk and kinfolk, hopefully they're aware of some of those issues that we discussed earlier, and are appropriately responding to them. But it's a bit of a catch-22, because you're excited for them having reached that role, but also I know many places where that's not, there's not going to be any advancement beyond that. So a lot of times it'll look like dean of culture. Sometimes though, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily have a name. It's just and this is why, like, it's almost like a microaggression. It's difficult to like put words to or name specifically, and so people assume that it's just not happening. But there's a lot of teachers who will talk about being the person that like other teachers will grab to talk to kids on their way from making copies. Do you imagine that every single day, to have teachers around you who don't want to deal with certain students, so you're grabbed constantly, that kind of thing. A couple of years ago, I had a position where I was helping some students out with a club that they wanted to run a Black Girl Magic club. So I was facilitating that specific club. Somehow in the midst of running that club and putting together a social justice event that our Black Student Union wanted to have, I got pegged as the woman who would handle all things regarding race. So
the woke teacher.
I had like white teachers who would approach me about something a student said, or like a principal asked me, do you think it's okay for me to wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt? Should I avoid taking pictures? Like these kinds of things. And it's just, it's being pegged. And sometimes it's in an official role, and sometimes it's literally just microaggressions where people are expecting you consistently to be the disciplinarian, or the big brother or big sister who's gonna like talk to the kids and call their parents. And it's wonderful. Like, we love kids, we love parents, we want to be able to be engaged in that work, but we should not be expected to do it on a higher level, especially when teachers are not doing that work themselves.
Right. Like, you're not a proxy for the work that schools need to do to develop the relationships they need to develop with parents and community.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So instead of bringing in the trainings, instead of actively working on these things, we just call Andrea.
Right. And I saw a tweet the other day where a person was like, if it was a Black male educator, and he said, if you're having an issue with a student and you have really worked on that relationship and you're still struggling, like, feel free to call me and let's all sit down together. But don't just shove them into my room as if like I'm Jesus Christ and touching the hem of my garment is going to magically fix everything. Like, I'm not a magician. Right. I just do the work. And I think the difference is that Black educators are expected to do that work because we are Black. So it's assumed that like, oh, you'll be great at relationship building, you'll be great at these things. And white folks sometimes get away with not necessarily doing that.
So thank you for that. So in preparation for this conversation, you sent over some notes, some things for us to touch on. And my follow-up question is referring to those notes is, you mentioned a culture of silence, because all the things that you're talking about, I've heard people say anecdotally in circles with Black teachers. I myself, being in one of these schools at one point, was saying a lot of the same things, but these conversations are being had around the water cooler, at a happy hour after work, now thankfully with Black teacher Griot. But why just there? Why not more in other spaces where more people can hear? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that this is another one of the things that makes New Orleans a bit of a unique system, because it's all charter. There's no space for teacher organizing. And so whereas when I was in Philly, I wasn't like heavily involved with the union, but I knew that the union existed, and I was involved with an organizing group of educators where if something was really happening and I wasn't sure about it, I could go to educator elders and mentors and say, this is what's happening in my classroom. Yes, we are a charter school, but ... and I'm not sure how I should handle it. What should I do?
Right.
Here in New Orleans, there's no space for that. And additionally, because we are an all charter and because we live in a, what is the word? An at-will state where essentially you can be terminated whenever they feel like for whatever reason, people are hesitant and scared to push back, and they're scared to even ask questions. I've known educators who have been threatened for being threatened with termination for being out sick, for for talking about a certain individual, for trying to organize and problem solve with other teachers. And so when that happens enough times, you learn to just be quiet. So yeah, I think genuinely like that is the major issue, that there's no space for organizing, and also because this is an all charter at will state or city at least, you could be terminated at any point, and it's threatening and scary.
Right. And I was going to get towards the end of the conversation, like, what you think needs to happen, but I kind of want to ask that question now. How do you think we need to address some of those issues, the lack of the ability to organize, the disconnection across schools and charter management organizations, this culture of silence, the fear of losing your job, your income, your livelihood? What are some of the things that you think, what are some levers that you think that we can pull to address some of those things?
Yeah, well, I think organizations like Open automatically are sort of addressing the problem because they're allowing space for professional development that we don't usually get. And it's on these topics this week. There's so many things that you guys are talking about this week that are like, oh my gosh, teachers have been asking for this in classrooms, but we can't get them in professional development. So one is our own professional development that's addressing some of those larger issues that we talk about. Another is that, I don't know. I think we just have to do it. Like, we just have to decide that we're going to organize ourselves and create spaces for that professional development that we need, demand the things that we need. It's difficult. It is really difficult though, because it is scary. And people need jobs at the end of the day. They need money. Like, you can't just, but when you have administrators essentially telling you what you can and can't do, it can be really scary. I think the answer is that we need to be more involved with organizations like Open and like Black Teacher Griot and like Black Ed NOLA that are trying to bring people together to talk about these issues. And then we just have to sort of bite the bullet and make the time to organize ourselves.
Right. And the system, to your point of just how disconnected folks are across the system, we try to be able to reach teachers. It's very difficult. Everyone has these different email addresses, with the teacher turnover rate being what it is. The teachers that existed last year are not the same teachers this year. So it's even hard to get a singular message out to all teachers across the district. And I always joke, but I probably need to stop joking about it and doing it. I was like, we need for teachers to all have an email address to one account.
Right.
So that I can just get a message out to you, like, hey, we're going to offer a free IEP clinic, spread the word. We're going to have, for example, a little education happy hour on Friday, come through. We can't even get that information out to all of the teachers, things to just, show them a good time or help support them or their students, because it's just really all over the place.
Yeah.
And that disconnection, that's within a school, but then you also talked about being disconnected from the larger community, particularly Black community elders, veteran teachers and such. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like and how that impacts the work?
Yeah, I had a conversation with the ED of Black Ed NOLA recently. Um, Adrinda?
Hmm.
Wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
But I was just during the conversation, I was having so many feelings around. She was talking about what she got from being a student in New Orleans, from being a Black kid raised in New Orleans who went to these schools, and like what 3-5 did for her.
Hmm.
And she kept referring to it as like spiritual deposits. Like
Mm.
she felt like her teachers and her administration and her staff in the school as a whole, like spiritually deposited into her, so that things like grace and confidence that that she was able to gain from her schooling experience. Um and it's so amazing to hear those stories. And as an educator, I'm on my 12th year right now, but I have circles of friends, folks who are in their second year, folks who are in their fourth year, folks who are coming up on 10, kind of thing. And when you come to a place like New Orleans, where that is so unique, the community is everything. It's a big part of everything. So to become a teacher here and to be roped into community in all of these different ways, but then in your career to automatically lose that connection
Mhm.
is rough.
Yeah.
And the conversation that I had with Adrena was amazing, because we were talking about the ways in which speaking with elder teachers can really benefit your practice,
Right.
how much insight they give you on the culture itself, on the community, on students, on parents. They are parents, so they, you know what I'm saying? Where if you're a Black person who moves here from wherever, and you've only been here for a year or two, your connections are more so on a shallow level.
Yeah.
Um, and so, we all know what happened with Katrina, with the firing of the teaching force and the principal or administrative force as well. And I feel like we've lost out on that potential connection that could happen,
Mhm.
um, because we don't know where those teachers are.
Right.
I know that they're here. I don't know, the same thing that you were saying just now, like, I don't know where to find them. I don't know.
Right.
And also, like, I want to acknowledge the trauma that they've been through. Like,
Yeah.
maybe they don't want a young teaching force from outside of the community coming to ask them a lot of questions. But the point is that we don't know, and we don't even have the opportunity to create those connections and even ask those questions and see how people feel about things, because, it doesn't exist.
Right, right. We had a session the other day about how to bridge the disconnect between Native New Orleanian students and families and transplant educators.
Mhm.
And we had a lot of folks, adults, who were born and raised in New Orleans and who matriculated through the public education system pre-Katrina, who are all very successful now because all of the schools were not terrible.
Right.
And they all said the same thing, like we have a culture here. Everyone said the same thing. My teachers lived in my community with me. They went to my church. We would run into them in the store. They might have educated some of my siblings. They knew me. They were connected to me. And that changed the dynamic in the classroom. They handled me differently if I was having a bad day. It
Mhm.
wasn't automatically a disciplinary thing. And they just understood who I was and where I was coming from. They understood what the gaps were and how to fill them and how to get those resources. And we basically swapped that out en masse for a large new group of people who didn't know any of that.
Yeah.
And we expect them to be able to teach our kids. And another thing that kept coming up is not in that disconnection from their community in terms of their community being in their classroom. The words humanity, dehumanizing came up quite a
Mhm.
bit,
Mhm.
where they feel like in this new system they're not treated like humans. And if you don't feel like you are being treated in a humane way, there's no way that those spiritual deposits can
Mhm.
happen. And so the disconnection is across schools, it's within schools, it's between schools and communities, it's across generations. It's just a lot of disconnection, and we're expecting kids to be able to thrive in an environment where all the adults are not on the same page. And so that kind of brings me to the next part, which is like this lack of unity across schools. Tell me, do you think it's just circumstantial? Do you think it's intentional? What do you think is happening there where the teachers, Black, white, or other, at one school are just completely disconnected from what's happening in another school?
Yeah, well, I want to address that for sure, but I did want to hit on one point that you made while you were talking. When you were talking about Black Native New Orleanians and the experiences that they're having with educators and sort of that swap out of these local community folks and us coming in mass. I think a big part of the dehumanization is the narrative that we're sold as outsiders about these schools and about these students.
Right.
One of the first PDs that I went to out here it was a PD on like how we know charters are working. And they spent an hour and a half, like this is in a it's supposed to be school PD, so we're supposed to be getting ready for the school year.
Right.
But we spent an hour and a half telling us like these are the numbers, this is what it was before, so like we know that it's working. And folks love data. Everybody loves data. Data's fantastic. But there's a cognitive dissonance when all the data that you keep shoving in my face says this, and then I keep meeting people like Adrena. I hope I'm not saying her name. Adrenda.
Yeah.
I keep meeting people like Adrenda and other successful Black folks out here who went to all of these schools pre-Katrina and say that they were amazing.
Yeah.
And so like there's
disconnect.
Yeah, something's got to be off if you're telling me that like the narrative around them literally are just that the schools were so awful, the kids
couldn't read.
And what does that say about the people who live here, the people who were teaching, and the students themselves? If the narrative is that like they literally weren't learning anything and the schools were so awful that we just had to toss everything and start over. So I think like a big part of the dehumanization or the humanization rather, is that not just Black educators, but all educators, if you're going to come here, have to reject that narrative off top. Like that cannot be true. And like we respect the community. They can't go together. It doesn't work together. Right. So we're not in control of what they are trying to say. We know we're working within a powerful system, people who have a lot of money, the people who run media and who put stories out there. Right. We're not in control of what those stories say, but we can use our common sense and say that like these people are people, and yeah, just commonsensical stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, I needed to like ramble about that because I realized
that's real. Yeah.
Until my second or third year, where I was just like, bro, this doesn't make any sense. And it's literally how they're getting educators to come here. The narrative that they're telling all these people is that the schools have gotten so much better and things are so amazing because they were so bad beforehand. But that is predicated on the idea that they aren't intelligent, that they didn't know how to run their own community, didn't know how to run their own schools, when really we should be coming here and sitting down and listening to the people who did it before, so that we can hopefully kind of, follow in their footsteps and craft something good and or better. In terms of the disconnect across schools and across networks, and that I believe it's intentional. I think when you intentionally set up a school district that's not a school district, and there's no unified anything, and there's 75 different schools with this many CMOs and this many school calendars, and you're intentionally creating a dysfunction in your system. Right. Like when we stop and we think about the impact that has on parents, if I have a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old, they're running completely different schedules. They have completely different, Anyways, I'm about to like go off on a whole but the point is that setting that system up in that way, I can't imagine that the folks who designed that did not consider that there would be little space for connection across schools and across networks. Like that had to have been on someone's mind when it was set up. And I'm not trying to go like full-blown conspiracy theory and be all the way out there, but I think that it was something that folks knew and that there was never any work done to address it. Even now, if you were trying to build across schools, it's like you said, you are essentially, you're grabbing a connect over at 35, you're grabbing a connect at Carver, you're grabbing a connect at Sci-High, and grabbing a connect at the KIPS, and hoping that they get in touch with people and get back to you.
Right.
There's no way for unified sort of, nothing is unified, but there's no way for that connection to happen organically. You have to put in the work in order to do it. And too many teachers, so many of us are so busy surviving that we don't have the time or the capacity to do the work that may lead to us thriving in the future because we just don't have the capacity for it. So what happens is you could work here for years and never ever talk to educators in a different CMO than you.
Right, that's facts. And this makes me think about a couple of conversations that I was in just the other day. So we had a session at the Community Book Center. You know, Mama Vera and Mama Jennifer were there. And Mama Jennifer was like, you know, what people really need to understand is that, you know, Louisiana is a slave state. She pulls no punches, okay?
Mama Jennifer win.
Right, but just before then, I had attended a meeting, and the artist Dred Scott was there, and he talked about the upcoming 1811 slave rebellion reenactment that's going to happen November 8th through 9th. And he talked about, you know, his research in terms of how that rebellion was organized. And it was, you know, a person who trusted an enslaved person who trusted other enslaved folks in different plantations, letting them know about this and getting them to organize there. And while I was sitting there listening to him, I was like, it's a shame that the way that enslaved African Americans had to organize back then is how we have to organize now with this system. I'm sitting there like, wow. Wow. It shouldn't be that way in 2019, but this is where we still are. So I just wanted to put that out there. You talked about, in terms of solutions, you said, you know, that professional development piece needs to be in there. People need to get connected to these community-based organizations. You talk about the kinds of trainings that are lacking that needs to be put underneath that professional development umbrella that people just should be doing. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so everyone should be in anti-racism training. It's 2019. Like, we know the impact that bias has. We know the impacts that institutional racism has on our students. You know, there's more and more research that's coming out about the impact that it's having on us as educators. We know the impacts of these things. Everyone should be involved in anti-racism training off top. And I don't mean one training, I mean like a consistent plan that is set up throughout the school year with you and an organization. So that's one. The other thing I think is linking in these community organizations. So, you know, I do a lot of work, as you know, with Rethink. Shout out to KG at Rethink. I think allowing educators to be involved with those, or bringing in those folks for anti-ageism training, right, which is a big one. When you combine that with the, you know, racial bias that people have, ageism and racial bias, we see things like increased suspensions and push out and whatnot. So I think linking with organizations like Rethink, organizations like Nahliah, who want to come in and lead these trainings on certain biases that we may have is useful. I also think that we need specific support around, or we need specific training around supporting Black educators and even educators of color in these specific systems to deal with some of the microaggressions that we talked about that often lead to us leaving the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's just affinity spaces where we can work out things on our own. But I know that like I can't in a school talk to the other Black educators and problem solve around some of the things that we're dealing with white folks in the room.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't because I'm scared, because I'm worried. And then because a lot of times they center themselves and then we end up,
taking care of their feelings.
Yeah. I think those things are useful. And then, just regular old useful professional development. So helping educators to be able to perfect their craft or to better their craft. So there's a lot of stuff right now on things like disrupt text, right? Which is like, it's a hashtag, but it's also like a movement and a conference where English teachers and educators in general are coming around together to figure out like, how do we disrupt the canon to bring our students texts that are more reflective of them and reflective of what's happening in the world around us so that we can have deeper conversations around sort of the systems of oppression that they're dealing with. Whenever I'm involved in those conversations, in those circles, I'm so fed and I feel so happy, but I get really sad because I know that I'm not even sure that those conversations are happening here in New Orleans because people are so focused on state tests. We're all focused on the EOCs. We're all focused on the ACT. We're trying to pull up the SPS scores. And because we're so focused on that, we don't get to have conversations around the things that we know improve student achievement. We know that they improve student achievement. So if we could, this is a larger thing, but if we could perhaps not focus on those things
right
as much and perhaps focus on the things that everyone knows improve test scores and improve student achievement, then it will be beneficial.
Right. Thank you for that. And that just also reminds me, disrupts text. I have not heard of that, so I'm definitely going to look it up. But it also reminds me of Radical Math. It's started by these two Black male math teachers out of California, and it has to be about 15 years old now. But using math and fractions and probability and percentages to talk about, the prison industrial complex, to talk about poverty, to talk about all of these things, and taking the, math skills and relating it to the things that kids need to know about if they're already not experiencing those institutions and things like that. So thank you for that. And we definitely need like a PD resource. I think that teachers want to know about these things. All teachers want to know about, not all, but teachers who are interested, no matter their racial or ethnic background, they just really don't know where to get this information. So that's important. One of the last things I want to talk about is like, so we're having this conversation. You've had these conversations with a lot of teachers, but you're also saying that for systems leaders, these conversations are probably not being had. They're probably not being had in depth. And, they're often, sometimes what happens is because these conversations are not happening, people are kind of like vocally avoiding them. They're saying, well, we don't know this. We don't know that this is an issue. We don't really know what to do with it. So can you talk a little bit about the transparency around that between administrators, staff, or leadership in staff, and what needs to happen there to get folks in those positions of leadership and administration to be connecting with Black teachers to address some of the things we talked about today?
Yeah, I think that a school or an administration that really, really, really wants to tackle these issues will. Mm-hmm. And I think that they will do that first by creating a culture of conversation, a culture of, I don't want to say a culture of accountability because homies and flip that whole, whole phrase into something else. But, a culture where we can call one another on things and push for our growth as teachers, as administrators, so on and so forth. A big part of why that culture of silence that we were talking about exists is because there's so little administration in my experience, or so little transparency in my experience. between administration and the teaching staff.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times, like we said, because it's an at-will state, decisions just kind of get made, and
yeah.
you get told that this is what it is and this is how it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just came here from somewhere else, or even if you've been here for a couple of years, you internalize that, like, this is what it is and this is how it has to be, kind of thing. And so transparency is a huge thing that I think you can't have the culture of conversation. You can't have the culture of like growth, staff growth. We talk a lot about student growth, but how are your staff growing and developing themselves? How are they getting better because they're in your school? Nobody ever asks that question. The question is always on student growth, but if your staff aren't growing and developing, your students, if they started out a certain way with those staff, you know what I'm saying? Like, this is all going to impact one another. And so I think staff or administration can start off by asking that question of like, how are our staff growing and developing as educators? What do they actually want? What do they want to see? How do they themselves want to grow as teachers? In what ways can we help to support that? And I think by doing that, it opens the lane for conversations. Mm-hmm. Right now, in most schools that I've worked in, the lane for conversations isn't even open. You can go to your administration about like, you know, really insignificant things. But in terms of like these larger scale changes that we're talking about, that's not something that they're open to, because I don't know why, because they're so focused on SPS scores, and they know how they want to raise SPS scores, and I guess that's it.
But you're also, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
No, go ahead, because I feel like I didn't quite answer your question.
Yeah. So. But I mean, just listening to you speak, I also feel like to really address these things, what's really going to happen is you're going to have to rethink relationships of authority, power, control. When you're talking, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like I wonder, if not, I'm assuming in large part that you want to avoid these conversations because we do have a racial divide in terms of, you know, school leadership and, you know, teaching staff, as well as a gender sex divide as well. We definitely have a wealth divide in terms of how much people get paid for the work that they do. So when you're saying, you know, we really need to be actively anti-racist, well, that means structural changes. That means, right? That doesn't mean everything stays the same, but treat Black teachers better. It actually means we need to rethink who's leading schools, who's leading classrooms, how much they get paid, how much authority they have to make decisions independently and in groups, supporting organizing. And that means that you're supporting pushback to the status quo that holds you in a position of power over other folks. So I think that could also be the reason why some of the lanes are closed.
You right sign where I was just like, you right. You right, girl. That's it. Nobody wants to push up against sort of what has put them in a position of power, what has made them their money. I don't know why it feels like it's worth noting right now that like so many schools here, people are teaching for 2-3 years and becoming deans and becoming assistant principals and becoming principals and whatnot. And like you mentioned, they're from places outside of New Orleans. So it's just like, I don't know. I'm not sure, like that feels like heavy on my heart right now and worth mentioning, that it's just when all these things sort of tie together, like this need for transparency, this need for communication, this culture of silence, and then these unjust, quite frankly, power structures where some people have just been propped up, and that's where they're going to be, and that's what it is. Right. But yeah, all these things are connected.
Yeah. So you said you have, you know, friends and acquaintances across the spectrum in terms of their years in the classroom, and you're also, you know, in community with folks who were in the classroom. They were excited to be there. Yeah. Now they are exiting the classroom a lot earlier than they thought that they would. What do you say to those teachers who got in it for the right reasons? They're coming in with the right mindset, but they become so dismayed that they want to exit the classroom early. What do you say to those teachers? What conversations do you have?
Well, I mean, the start of conversations is around your mental health and your well-being. So if you have to go, you have to go. And
Mm-hmm.
I think like the one thing that I have learned here in New Orleans, because of my organizing work with a couple of different collectives and folks, is that I don't ever want to be like judgy
Mm-hmm.
about anybody. We all got to make our money and we all got to have peace of mind
Yeah.
or strive for it. So so sometimes we work within systems that are toxic. Sometimes we work at schools that are known for being this or that, or sometimes we, quite frankly, are a part of and perpetuate systems of inequality and enforce them on our Black students, while we ourselves are sort of under the heel of it too. So I start conversations with that nobody is better than anybody else. We're all out here struggling. We're all out here trying to figure it out.
Right.
If for your mental health you need to step away, do what you got to do. But I try to tell them, a lot of the conversations that I have with folks are that teaching doesn't have to look like this.
Mm-hmm.
I think the beauty of my resume and the beauty of my experience is that I've been in so many different types of schools in
Mm-hmm.
so many places. So I've been in independent schools. I've taught in Colorado, Philly, Boston, and here. And I've been in alternative schools, and I've been in charters, and I've been in neighborhood schools. And yeah, I try to emphasize that that it doesn't have to look like this, right? And so like you're here in New Orleans, so we have to deal with the system that's been handed to us, but like what are the ways in which we can work together to disrupt that if you have the capacity? Because like I said, so many teachers are struggling with the day-to-day that they don't have the capacity to dream build. They don't. So if you have the capacity and you want to build with me, like hit me up. Let's do some Black Teacher Griot stuff together. Let's build and plan events or create those spaces for one another. If you don't have the capacity, step away if you need to, but know that like please don't take this as all that there is and all that there will be. What I will say is a lot of educators have left the system and have gone into youth work. Some are looking into ed policy to think about like how to change systems and structures. So try to take that passion that you have for youth and for education and see if it can be channeled in a different way until you're ready to come back into the classroom. And my hope and my dream is that they're always ready to come back into the classroom, because if you're called for this work, then we need you, period.
Right, right. What are some of the things that we have to look forward to at Black Teacher Griot?
Yeah. So our next event is a book swap that I'm really excited about because I'm
Nice.
a geek and I like books. We are looking at running it the weekend after Thanksgiving break. And yeah, it's just going to be, I mean, we're calling it Booze and Books. So we're going to do some swapping of books. We're going to have a lot of comics. We're getting donations. It's really exciting. For those teachers, a lot of people are in schools that don't have libraries and they want texts for their students, and they are looking to get texts that are not canonical. So if they can get some of those texts that we're talking about with Disrupt Text, then they'd be really excited about it. So we're trying to gather as many of those as we can. Like there's so much dope young adult fiction that's out right now. So we're trying to gather a lot of that. That's what we have coming in December. And then next year, we're hoping to do a book group with the text, We Want to Do More Than Survive, abolitionist teaching. So those are our two big things on the radar.
Right. So community resources, professional development, networking, and that's an example of other things that people can do in their spaces. If you're not going to come out to Black Teacher Griot, maybe there's a couple of the teachers that you're around the water cooler with talking about how this is messed up are the people that on a Saturday you guys can go out to brunch and swap books and have a conversation and put resources in each other's hands.
Yeah, I think that I think that to better answer the question that you asked earlier of like what to do when you're in this space and you almost want to leave, the answer also is just lean on each other. So like find your tribe at the school, or in education somewhere, because you need people who know the work, and lean on them. Get together for work dates, get together for grading parties, swap books and resources, have them look at your curriculum. If there's stuff in your curriculum that, this happens a lot with new teachers, they get handed curriculum that they have to teach. And sometimes there is a level of cognitive dissonance around what you have to teach because it's not super exciting. It's not engaging. It's not really talking about the things that students are dealing with right now, but schools have assigned them because they supposedly are going to help bring up test scores. So if you're a newer teacher, find an elder educator in your building, because a lot of us know how to flip that. We know how to work within the curricular framework and still bring things in. Find a mentor, like definitely find a mentor. Those things, I think the more that we are leaning on each other in community, the better off we'll be.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to stop there. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, Andrea. I'm a big supporter of Black Teacher Griot. I'm just excited that that space exists. I thoroughly enjoy all of the events, and I'll be at the future ones. And I encourage folks, if you are in New Orleans, if you are a Black teacher or Black educator and you want community, and all of this resonates with you, to reach out to Black Teacher Griot and Andrea and follow you guys on Instagram. You're on Facebook?
We are not on Facebook. We're on Twitter. So
okay.
Twitter,
Instagram and Twitter, and get involved, but then also take this wisdom into your community, your small school community, and start doing some organizing there. Reach out to Open. We want to know where all the Black teachers are. We want to know where all the teachers are. We want to know where all the Black teachers are.
Give us the list.
So that we can share resources with you and support you in this work, because it really is about the kids. But you know, to make sure that the kids are right, we have to make sure that the adults that are in front of them are right. So thank you very much, Andrea, for this conversation. Thank you all for who are watching this. Please, save this video and refer back to it. And that's going to be the end of this, but not the end of this work. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and infinite gratitude for Open. I love working with you guys.
All right, great. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.